Hi, welcome to Dig Into China. I'm Dong Shang, where we explore China in depth to reveal unique perspectives. A recent news story has drawn widespread attention. Brazil's Labor Department has accused the Chinese company BYD of exploiting its workers. According to the department, Chinese laborers building BYD factories in Brazil are subject to conditions akin to slavery. Reports indicate that these workers often work 7 days a week and are largely confined to their dormitories, with their passports confiscated and their freedom of movement restricted. The Brazilian government has compared BYD's actions to modern-day slavery. It is no longer the 19th century. We are now in 2025. For China to still depend on Brazil to safeguard the rights of its workers is a great embarrassment. Indeed, Brazil has every reason to criticize China. According to official data from China, the average work week for Chinese laborers is 49 hours, while in Brazil, the average is 39.4 hours, over a full day less per week than in China. Why do Chinese people work so hard? What are the underlying reasons for their struggles? In this discussion, I'll explore why life is so difficult for Chinese people and why I believe the hardships they face are a result of both Xi Jinping's policies and the influence of China's traditional culture. To start, although I'm using working hours as an example to highlight the hardships faced by Chinese people, the struggles extend beyond just work. From a young age, including our education, nearly everything we do is demanding. In my opinion, these hardships are largely driven by two factors: Xi Jinping's policies and China's traditional culture. Let's begin with China's traditional culture. However, I believe the hardships caused by this culture are not limited to China alone, but extend across the entire East Asian cultural sphere. The five countries, South Korea, Taiwan, China, North Korea, and Vietnam, share a similar cultural foundation. Japan is sometimes included in this group as well. A common trait among people in these East Asian nations is that life tends to be difficult, with long working hours and demanding academic pressures. For instance, beyond China's prevalent 996 work culture, Japan and South Korea have long grappled with the problem of overwork-related death. The intense pressure to focus on studying from a young age isn't exclusive to China either. Similar challenges can be found in South Korea, Taiwan, and other regions. A common explanation for these hardships is the idea that the East Asian country cultivates a strong ability to endure difficulties. There are also numerous theories as to why East Asians in particular excel at enduring hardships. Some attribute it to East Asia's long history of imperial rule, which they believe has cultivated a submissive mindset. Others point to Confucian culture, which emphasizes endurance and hard work. Among these theories, I find Gia Hofstede's cultural dimension theory, developed by the renowned sociologist, to offer the most insightful explanation of East Asian cultural characteristics. Hofstede suggests that East Asian cultural traditions are deeply rooted in long-term orientation. This perspective emphasizes enduring hardship now for future rewards, suffering first to enjoy comfort later, and striving for lasting happiness. Essentially, it reflects a preference for delayed gratification, which explains the widespread ability of East Asians to endure challenges. In contrast, Western countries often lean towards a mindset of immediate gratification. Hofstede's research highlights this difference, with East Asian countries scoring highly in long-term orientation. South Korea at 100, Taiwan at 93, Japan at 88, and China at 87. In comparison, Brazil scores 44, while the United States ranks even lower at 26. This long-term orientation encourages people throughout the East Asian cultural sphere to take on high-intensity work. However, East Asian culture and its focus on long-term goals are not the only reasons for China's excessively long working hours and grueling lifestyles. Currently, working hours in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are relatively moderate. South Koreans work about 1,900 hours annually. Taiwanese around 2,000 hours, and the Japanese even less, at under 1,600 hours. While these figures remain higher than in many other countries, they are far from China's astonishing average of approximately 2,450 hours per year. So, what distinguishes China from these countries? This brings us to another key factor, the personal influence of Xi Jinping. Looking at history, I often say that the histories of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, especially South Korea and Taiwan, represents a more advanced versions of China. In earlier periods, these countries also experienced long working hours. Japan's peak came in the 1970s and the 1980s, when the average annual working hour reached 2,200. South Korea's peak came after the 1980s, when annual working hours hit 2,500, similar to China's current situation. Taiwan's peak likewise occurred in the 1980s, with working hours averaging between 2,300 and 2,400 annually, similar to China today. However, after reaching these peaks, the working hours in these countries started to decline. So why did they experience a reduction in working hours after their peak, while China has not? Is it because China's development is not yet at the right stage? To answer this, we need to look back at historical context behind their decline in working hours. Looking back at the histories of South Korea and Taiwan, we see that their peak working hours occurred between the 1980s and the 1990s. What was the historical backdrop during this time? Essentially, both countries has reached the peak of their development as emerging economies and were on the brink of transitioning into developed nations. This also marked the peak of a particular economic model, the labor-intensive economy. The early development paths of China, South Korea, and Taiwan were quite similar, with all three rapidly growing by becoming global manufacturing hubs. A key factor in their success as the world's factory was the long-term orientation inherent in East Asian culture, which fostered a spirit of intense competition and involution. One might wonder why East Asian countries like China became the world's manufacturing hub rather than Latin American countries. The answer lies in the fact that the workforce in Latin America is less willing to endure grueling 996 work hours. Without this willingness, the efficiency of a labor-intensive economy would suffer, leading international capitals to avoid setting up productions in these countries. Since South Korea and Taiwan developed earlier than China, by the 1980s and the 1990s, they had already reached the peak of developing nations. This signifies the end of the labor-intensive model. Once a developing country reaches its peak, the next step is to become a developed nation. To achieve this, it's clear that relying on cheap labor is no longer viable. Instead, technological innovation is essential. At this stage, both South Korea and Taiwan recognized the problem. They realized that continuing to extend working hours was no longer sustainable. As a result, both countries began to shift their approach. They started reducing working hours and moved away from relying on cheap labor and the intensity of work as the main driver of economic growth. Instead, they focused on improving workers' wages and conditions, enhancing public welfare, and developing stronger markets. Their goal was to promote technological advancement through market-driven growth, making it the core of their economic development. At this point, South Korea and Taiwan also began their transitions to democracy. From this viewpoint, China should have reached a similar turning point where labor hours could start to decrease. By around 2018, China had already reached the peak of a developing nation and needed to move toward becoming a developed country. This meant that relying on intense labor was no longer sustainable, and China needed to start its own transformation. However, this transformation clearly did not happen in China. After 2018, China's working hours actually began to increase. The reason for this shift, I believe, is largely due to Xi Jinping. Under his misguided views and flawed economic policies, China ended up taking a completely different direction. A recent interview with the Wall Street Journal revealed that Xi Jinping's understanding is so lacking that he doesn't even grasp the risk of deflation. According to sources close to the top echelons of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi once asked his advisors, "What's wrong with deflation? Isn't it good that the prices are lower?" What's even more concerning is that because of this lack of understanding, deflation has become a taboo topic within China's policymaking circles. This passage from the Wall Street Journal highlights that Xi Jinping, as the head of China's economy, lacks fundamental economic understanding. While it's not expected for the general public to be familiar with the dangers of deflation, it is truly shocking that Xi, as China's top leader, has such a significant gap in this crucial area of knowledge. Sometimes a lack of common sense isn't the most alarming issue, even if the person is the highest leader of the country. In Xi Jinping's case, beyond his lack of common sense, he operates with his own ideological framework. This ideology is a blend of East Asian or Confucian culture and Marxism. Within this framework, Xi firmly believes that production drives everything, downplaying the importance of demand. For him, increasing production alone can resolve all economic problems. Additionally, influenced by Marxism, Xi emphasized the importance of government planning, viewing capital as chaotic and inherently evil, and arguing that technological innovation should not be driven by consumer demand in a market economy, but should instead be directed by the government. In this framework, the solution to overcoming the middle-income trap and achieving developed nation status for China revolves around the significant government support for high-tech industries to boost productivity. However, this approach ultimately leads to a more difficult life for ordinary Chinese citizens. Some might not immediately grasp how Xi Jinping's approach is linked to the struggles of daily life. The logic behind it is this: a government's resources are limited, and those resources can either be used to stimulate consumption or boost production. In a deflationary environment, what are the outcomes of consistently prioritizing production over consumption? This situation inevitably leads to decreased consumption and an oversupply of products. With less demand and too many goods in the market, businesses struggle to sell their products. Despite this, the central government continues to push for more production. As a result, the business profits are further squeezed. To cope with the lower profits, companies are forced to cut costs by squeezing their workers, paying them less, and extending their working hours in order to maintain profitability. The end result is that the public's quality of life deteriorates as they work longer for less. This strategy will undoubtedly make life harder for the people, but Xi Jinping is aware of it. In his perspective, the increased hardship is seen as a necessary sacrifice, even viewed as a competitive advantage for China. A Financial Times report earlier revealed that the central technical officials and the political commissars had a heated debate about Trump's 60% tariff. During the discussion, a Politburo member stated, "We were able to defeat them before and we can do it again. The reason we can win is because we can endure hardships while the pampered Americans cannot." This mixture of ideology has driven Xi Jinping into a dangerously obsessive state, resulting in a fragmented Chinese economy. The massive production stimulus has failed to spur growth and instead led to excessive overcapacity. Xi's approach persists this year, with Reuters reporting that China plans to issue a record 3 trillion yuan in bonds in 2025. The primary goal is to support high-tech industries and help companies upgrade their equipment, continuing to focus on stimulating production. Given this policy, it appears that the hardships for the Chinese people are far from over. In reality, enduring hardship isn't something that scares the Chinese. Was it not tough during the previous Hu administration? It was, and the labor rights were not well protected at that time. However, people didn't complain much. The key difference was that even while enduring the hardships, they were earning money and watching their lives improve little by little, with their assets growing along the way. A similar issue exists with China's university entrance exam system. The pressure of studying is intense, and there have long been complaints about the exam system. However, in the past, people were more willing to accept it because, to some extent, the exam provided a real opportunity for ordinary individuals to change their lives. But now, it's different. I've endured so much, working long hours every day, yet my wealth hasn't increased, and there's no room for personal growth. After all these years of hard study, it feels like it's all been for nothing, as if my efforts didn't make any difference. Chinese people in East Asian culture are not opposed to hardship. In fact, enduring hardship is a defining trait. The issue arises when hardship does not lead to improvement or even worsen their situation. This is why I believe the hardship faced by the Chinese people is shaped by both Xi Jinping's policies and the traditional cultural influences. Historically, the hardships during the previous administration, the Hu era, did bring some positive results. People endured difficulties with the expectation of earning more, and this struggle contributed to China's economic growth. South Korea and Taiwan also experienced similar challenges during the same period. The hardships of that time were paired with significant wealth growth, so they weren't necessarily perceived as true hardship. In contrast, today's struggles are different. They feel like pure hardship, suffering without any tangible rewards. The core issue with Xi Jinping's approach is that China has moved beyond the stage where enduring hardship was the focus. It has reached a point where the competition should be centered on technological innovation. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping seems unaware of this shift. He believes that innovation and economic progress can be driven by pushing the people to work harder, essentially manufacturing hardship. However, the country remains on this misguided path under his leadership. At this point, it seems that Xi Jinping is determined to continue down this current path, and the only way for the Chinese people to end their suffering may be to end his rule. I believe that day will eventually come, though I hope it arrives sooner rather than later. Thank you so much for watching. If you find this video helpful, please like it, drop a comment below, and hit the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube suggest my video to others. I'll be back with more content soon. Until then, be well.